Apparently, there's a fake version of the Shrek book circulating. I don't know who made this or why it appears to be a physical book, but this is not the source material that Shrek was based off of. Everybody's praising this fake version for being absolutely hilarious, but the actual Shrek book is still very funny, very good, and paints a very cohesive picture in conjunction with the films in the franchise. While people love to write off Shrek as just like funny memes with no actual substance, either out of pretentiousness or love of irony, the Shrek franchise, specifically the source material and the first two films, very clearly portray the plight of minorities, specifically Jewish people and Black people. Just for the record, I'm going to be focusing on the original source material for Shrek, which is the book, and the first two Shrek movies, because I refuse to acknowledge that Shrek 3 exists, and while Shrek 4 is very good, I'm not as familiar with it, and I wouldn't really have anything new to say about it that I'm not about to say right now. For those unfamiliar with the book, it follows the story of an ogre named Shrek, who's very ugly and very stinky. And after his parents kick him out of the house, he finds a witch in a forest who tells him that he's going to meet a princess who's even uglier than he is. And then he goes on a quest to find her, and he meets a bunch of characters and doesn't befriend any before finding the princess, and then they both bond over how ugly they are, and then they get married and live happily ever after and such. One of the first things that stood out to me about the book is the differences in character dialogue, because every character in the book speaks in poetry. They have a little block of rhyming verse that they say, either to introduce their character or just to talk. But Shrek never has that. Shrek always speaks in just plain prose until he meets the princess, and then they both speak in rhyming verse together, which is something that I'm going to get back to later. In the book, Shrek loves being an ogre and he relishes in it. Right before meeting the princess, he finds himself in a hall of mirrors and he's surrounded by himself. And at first, he's very just horrified and confused at what he's seeing, but then he realizes that it's him. And he was, quote, full of rabid self-esteem, happier than ever to be exactly what he was. This reminds me of an idea that I've been hearing, a quote that I've been hearing, but I haven't really been able to find a source for. Joy is an act of resistance. Being happy and loving the things about yourself that everyone else or the system looks down upon is resisting what the system is trying to do, namely tear you down, make you hate yourself, make others hate you. Shrek is othered and torn down, but he's still happy and still comfortable with his ogreness, which is something that we also see in the first movie. Similarly to the book, Shrek starts the first movie just being happy, being comfortable with being an ogre, and being happy with his life of solitude, until he meets Donkey and Fiona and he realizes that he's not actually happy with being alone, and being alone was his way of coping with a world that wasn't welcoming him, a world that didn't want him. He finds the love and companionship that his life had been missing, and he realizes that he both wants and needs that. He still wants to be an ogre, but he doesn't want to be an other. This mirrors Shrek switching to poetry when he meets the princess in the book. He wants to become like everyone else, but not in a way that undermines his ogreness, in a way that everyone else has been able to have love and these relationships, and he wants that, but he still wants the parts of himself that he loves that society might not like. In the first movie, Shrek loves Fiona because he sees what he loves about himself in Fiona, and besides like the actual being an ogre part of it, Fiona embraces them too. In Shrek 1, his problem isn't with Shrek and Fiona being ogres, his problem is with the society that doesn't want them to be ogres. In terms of like overt otherness in Shrek 1, there are the fairy tale creatures who are pretty much just treated like trash and sold off and herded to Shrek's swamp, which I will talk about in the next section. For those who haven't seen Shrek 2, the basic plot is that Fiona's parents, the king and queen of Far, Far Away, send to Shrek and Fiona, congratulating them on their marriage and inviting them to a royal ball where they can get their blessing for their marriage. But neither of them know that Shrek is an ogre and that Fiona is now a full-time ogre. So her dad, Harold, and her fairy godmother don't approve of this. They try to trick Fiona into marrying the fairy godmother's human son, Prince Charming. In Shrek 2, Shrek also starts off loving the fact that he and Fiona are ogres until he sees that being an ogre is causing Fiona pain. It's not really, but Harold and the fairy godmother convince Shrek that he and Fiona would be better off being humans, or that Fiona would be better off without him as a human, because Shrek can't change being an ogre on the inside. Because Harold and the fairy godmother cause him to essentially hate himself, he lets Fiona go so that she can be free of being an ogre, even after he takes a potion to turn them both into humans. At this point, they've internalized his hatred of himself so much that even though he knew before and knows now that he is an ogre and he always will be an ogre, now they've convinced him that that's a bad thing. Ultimately, it was Fiona again embracing her ogreness and telling Shrek that she loves being an ogre, she wants to be an ogre, that tells them both that they love each other for who they are and they shouldn't have to change for anybody. In terms of overt otherness within Shrek 2, it mainly comes in the form of dialogue, specifically what Harold says during the dinner scene.
An ogre from a swamp. Oh, how original.
Well, I suppose that will be a fine place to raise the children.
I just started eating.
Harold!
What's that supposed to mean?
Dad, it's great, okay?
Well, for his type, yes.
My type?
So, I suppose any grandchildren I could expect from you would be...
Ogres. Yes.
Not that there's anything wrong with that. Right, Harold?
Oh, no, of course not. That is assuming you don't eat your own young.
And what the fairy godmother tells Shrek as she manipulates him into self-hatred.
Ogres don't live happily ever after. It's time you stop living in a fairy tale, Shrek. She's a princess, and you're an ogre.
There are other instances of overt otherness in Shrek 2, but for right now I want to tie this into the real world. We've established that the book and movies clearly other Shrek, but how does Shrek's otherness parallel the experiences of people in the real world? To preface this section, I want to say I am not Jewish, and I want to be as respectful as possible, so I don't want to speak for or over Jewish people, which is why for this section I'm mostly just going to be directly quoting sources from and by Jewish people. The original Shrek book was written by William Steig. His parents were Jewish immigrants, and he started as a cartoonist for The New Yorker before going on to write children's books. And Shrek means fear or fright in Yiddish. Shrek 2's screenwriter David Weiss is Jewish, and this is what he had to say in an interview with Aish.com. Quote, "Actually, a main theme is based on something I heard from Rabbi Shlomo Goldberg, who heard it from Rabbi Noach Orlowek. It's a definition of love. What's important to you is important to me. At the meetings with DreamWorks executives, many who are Jewish, now and then I would mention that this is a traditional Jewish idea. It's really a basic theme of the film, and I'm proud to have helped steer things in that direction. So through Shrek, some Jewish wisdom is getting out to millions of Americans." End quote. An article on BearmanHouse.com said this about Shrek 2. Quote, "Another Jewish-like theme is the concept of being yourself, seen when Shrek chooses to remain true to his identity as an ogre rather than become like the people of Far, Far Away. This is a theme that's especially relevant during Hanukkah, when the Maccabees remain true to their faith instead of becoming like the Greeks." An aspect of Shrek 1 that's very reminiscent of the Jewish experience is Shrek's swamp being turned into a sort of ghetto for fairy tale creatures. To quote a Time article by Daniel B. Schwartz, quote, "The linkage between Jews and ghetto began in the early 16th century. Later, the word ghetto was resurrected to refer to new big city Jewish immigrant neighborhoods. Later still, during World War II, the Nazis revived the ghetto as a site of enforced Jewish segregation. Meanwhile, African Americans had begun employing the term ghetto to refer to their own residential segregation as early as the 1910s. The new black referent for ghetto truly came to the foray in the 1960s. Digital history resources reveal how the usage of the word ghetto soared in the 1960s and 1970s, and how phrases like Negro ghetto or increasingly Black ghetto came to eclipse Jewish ghetto. So although the word ghetto has a specific Jewish origin and an extensive history on how it affected Jewish people, nowadays society and pop culture, at least in America, associate the word with blackness, which leads me into the other real-world group that I want to bring up. My first thoughts watching Shrek 2 as a black person are how specifically a lot of it parallels the black experience. In Shrek 1, Shrek is different from the other fairy tale creatures because he's feared, and this fear mirrors the real-world's fear of black men, which leads to them being profiled and harmed. In terms of the overt imagery and dialogue of Shrek 2 that I mentioned earlier, a lot of it harkens specifically to the black experience. A lot of this is because, according to George Lucas's book Blockbusting, the script for Shrek 2 was largely based off of the 1967 movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, about a white woman who brings home a black fiancé to meet her parents. This is discussed in the article Green Face by Brady Hammond. Quote, "The Guess Who's Coming to Dinner plot device here frames the relationship between Shrek and Fiona not just as one of star-crossed lovers, but specifically of interracial lovers. Unlike Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, though, in which the white daughter of a couple returns home with her black fiancé, Fiona returns home not just with a green husband, but she now is a green woman. Through this cinematic illusion, the green skin of Shrek and Fiona once again becomes directly linked to black skin. Shrek 2's more open engagement with real-world race issues make the connection to black minorities much stronger. When Shrek and Fiona receive the invitation to the castle, Shrek immediately resists as he has experienced racism his entire life. He sums up the racism by noting that he will not be receiving any invitations to the country club. This citation of the traditionally white institution of the country club demonstrates that the film is very aware of the racial issues it brings up, particularly as they relate to minorities in the United States, such as blacks and Latinos. The things Harold says to Shrek in the dinner scene can be very easily translated into what a white father could say to his child's black partner. When Shrek turns into a human, he is suddenly treated completely differently. He walks down the street, or rides donkey down the street, and waves at people holding the pitchforks and torches that are specifically meant to harm him. And this reminds me of the fact that black people are scared of cops for obvious reasons, while white people can wave at them and even commit crimes in front of them and still come away unharmed. Shrek experiences the safety and privilege that he did not have as an ogre. The symbols of pitchforks and torches, as well as the beginning scene of Shrek 1, are also discussed in the article Green Face. Quote, "The story of the first Shrek film focuses heavily on race and difference. When first introduced, Shrek is going around his daily activities at his home in the swamp. Villagers arrive with torches and pitchforks to chase him away. Although there is no direct citation of the Ku Klux Klan, the late-night assault by all-white villagers with torches and pitchforks on a non-white to get him to leave his home bears a striking resemblance to the activities of the KKK. This particular iconography associates green not with a generic other, but with a black American other." All of this allusion to real-world groups begs the questions, is this actually harmful? Is it reductive to compare Jewish people or black people to dirty, smelly ogres? Is it useless to utilize these allegories in kids' media? Children's media can correctly and wonderfully portray real-world groups with a lot of nuance, and kids can understand it. Children absorb and make sense of everything they are presented with, so they do understand things. The problem, though, is that most adults don't know that kids can understand things, and that fact, along with fearing cancellation or backlash, keeps them from portraying anything outright or saying anything outright, which is frankly very annoying. Because yes, a franchise can depict the experiences of black people through a character that is not actually black, or it can have a covert gay couple, or it can have a neurodivergent coded character. But by refusing to say the words black or gay or autistic, you're not actually teaching a kid about these people. They understand and other in media, but if they're being raised in an environment that doesn't educate them on racism, ableism, homophobia, etc., then they understand why these characters are being put down, how they're different, and why that's bad and hurts their feelings, but they don't know what real-world groups are being talked about, and by extension, they don't know what language to use or what specifically to do to advocate for these groups when they grow up. This also prevents kids who are minorities from seeing themselves portrayed clearly and accurately. Here's a quote from Junot Diaz, a Dominican-American writer. Quote, "You guys know about vampires? You know, vampires have no reflections in a mirror. There's this idea that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. And what I've always thought isn't that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. It's that if you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. And growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. I didn't see myself reflected at all. I was like, yo, is something wrong with me? That the whole society seems to think that people like me don't exist? And part of what inspired me was this deep desire that before I died, I would make a couple of mirrors. That I would make some mirrors so that kids like me might see themselves reflected back and might not feel so monstrous for it." The issue of not portraying things overtly is especially prevalent in animation because of having non-human characters, and portraying a trans person, for example, as an alien when every other character is a human or at least humanoid turns an attempt at including a minority into just othering that minority further. It's the same principle as making the only member of a certain minority group in a piece of media a villain. It's an attempt at inclusivity, but by demonizing this character, there is the potential to demonize the whole group, as this character is the only representation of that group in this piece of media. On top of that, fiction and animation often have parts of the world or society that function different from our own, which further just muddles the allegory. Shrek includes both of these issues. Although it has a message of loving yourself for who you are, it still drives home the point that ogres are gross and disgusting. They eat gross food, they brush their teeth with bug guts, they make earwax candles, they burp and fart incessantly. Shrek also portrays race as a changeable thing, and while the message is essentially don't change your race, the fact that skin colors can change through magic weakens the allegorical connection to real-world race. The solution to this, at least the first steps to improving this, is to just say things outright and make sure that there is a good mix and variety of different groups represented in a piece of media, whether it be animated or real-world or otherwise. Gay, trans, autistic, and black are not bad words, and they all should be said if the goal is to portray those groups. They shouldn't have just one token minority character for each little minority box, because that can just come across as trying to boil down the entire minority into that one character, and that character being a villain or a negatively portrayed other just makes that even worse. What it boils down to is that real-world minorities should be explicitly talked about and specifically named in kids' media, but it needs to be done well and mindfully. One show that does a really good job of this is Sesame Street. In 1993, they had a racism episode where they actually called racists stupid.
Tully, there's just some really stupid people in the world who can't stand to see it when people of different races are friends.
They don't sugarcoat the issue or layer it with allegories or covert language. They take a firm stance in saying that this is a stupid thing to think, and they use real-world people to communicate this. They do bring the monsters into it.
Look, Telly, your skin is purple, right? And mine is pink. I mean, if it was up to that nut, if we were to listen to him, you and I couldn't be friends.
But this is okay because it relates the issue to a character that kids know and love, but it also has actual humans who exist in the real world, and now kids can know who these people are. The episode where they introduce an autistic character, Julia, uses explicit language and definitions. They have an episode where they introduce a deaf girl and explain sign language.
Hi, I'm editing, but I forgot something, so I wanted to say it now. Another good part of Julia's introduction is that she's a human puppet and she's not a monster, because Sesame Street also falls into the issue of like only having one character that is a certain minority or has a certain identity. So if Julia had been made a monster, it would have had the potential to like show all autistic people as monsters, but they didn't do that, which I appreciate.
Kids are able to both experience and Apparently, there's a fake version of the Shrek book circulating. Why it appears to be a physical book, but this is not the source material that Shrek was based off of. Everybody's praising this fake version for being sharing is caring, friendship is magic, steal from the wealthy. It is so within the realm of possibility to expand that list of morals to include gay people are people, racism is bad, everyone deserves respect.
I'm editing again, but I have another thing to say, because it is true that like a lot of, especially animation, has like worlds that function differently from ours, so like they can't really portray real world groups because like they don't have our real world groups in their world, but also they can portray those groups. Like they could expand the world or like elaborate on certain things to include like real world groups and actually name them. Like even in like a fantasy show, you could still have a character be trans and say that character is trans, and I don't think that would like mess up the world building or anything. Like it is still very possible for like animation or like fantasy to portray real world stuff. But also, if a piece of media wants to portray a group but doesn't want to take the steps to like fully name them or portray that group like mindfully or accurately, then I don't think they should do it, because I understand good intentions, but impact is greater than intent. And like I've been saying, not naming, not fully representing, not being careful about it, that just has a lot of potential for bad impact, no matter how good the intentions are.
Going back to what this video was actually about, a lot of people just write off Shrek and think of it as just a meme and nothing more, and I'm not saying that you need to like Shrek or you need to analyze every children's movie, and I'm especially not saying that a movie needs this kind of deep commentary to be a good or worthwhile movie. Movies that are just fun and just make you laugh are 100% good enough. What I'm trying to communicate here is that kids' media is undervalued and underestimated, which is unfair because there's often so much to unpack and lots of good intentions from the creators. This underestimating of kids' media is what leads to it not portraying anything overtly, and people thinking that kids shouldn't be exposed to or can't understand certain things when that's just not true. I'm sure that any minority can see themselves or facets of their experiences in Shrek, but as with any media that has this kind of subtext, it's important to look at how it specifically relates to the experiences of certain people, who wrote it, and what they were modeling. The original source material of Shrek and the themes of Shrek 2 were written specifically with the Jewish experience in mind, and part of the inspiration for Shrek 2, as well as the overt language and imagery throughout both Shrek 1 and 2, directly parallels the Black experience. Anyway, I really love the Shrek franchise for more than just what I said in this video. It was a big part of my childhood, and I'm really glad that I get to look at it through a different lens, as now I have more understandings of the world around me and how I relate to it.